My wife went out for a girls' night out and came home with kiss marks on her neck and the unmistakable smell of a men's perfume. She didn't even try to hide it. He walked through the door with that practiced smile and a look that seemed to defy reality. But the truth was there, impregnated in her skin, in her clothes, in the way she avoided my gaze and kept her bag tight against her body, as if hiding evidence of a crime that was already open before me. I didn't need to ask. I didn't need to hear half-baked excuses or improvised stories. What I saw was enough. And it was at that moment that I made my decision. Divorce was inevitable. But before that, I would disappear. Not to escape the pain, but so she would know exactly what it was like to be left behind. Silence was my first blow. I didn't scream, I didn't confront, I didn't let the anger express itself in words. I just looked at her, for a long time, taking in every detail of that face that I once loved. And then I turned my back. I went up to my room, grabbed a suitcase and started filling it with essential clothes. She walked in right behind, hesitantly, trying to gauge my reaction. "What are you doing?" His voice sounded hesitant, as if he still believed he could deceive me, as if the situation could be avoided with some poorly rehearsed excuse. I continued folding my clothes, methodical, impassive. When I zipped the suitcase and turned to her, it was the first time I saw her actually worried. She didn't expect that. "You're not even going to let me explain?" His voice wavered. It was the first time in years that I had seen a genuine trace of despair. But it wasn't because of regret, it wasn't because of what he did. It was out of fear of what would come next. Because at that moment, for the first time in our history, she realized she was about to lose. And then, I left. I turned off my cell phone. I left the city. I left my home, my life, my routine. I left everything that reminded me of her, everything that could pull me back to that nightmare. I needed time to breathe, to rebuild myself, to understand what was coming next. And most of all, I wanted her to feel the absence. That he felt the weight of loneliness, uncertainty, emptiness. For the first few days, I imagined she would try to find me. That he would call friends, family, that he might even beg for a second chance. But surprisingly, her silence was as absolute as mine. No messages. No attempt to reach me. And that made me question. Did she really care? Or was my departure a relief so he could live his forbidden romance without strings attached? The questions gnawed at my insides, but the truth was about to reveal itself. And what I would discover would change everything. Because the game wasn't over. I thought I had taken control of the situation by leaving, but in reality, I was just giving her the opportunity to show who she really was. I had no idea what was about to happen. But when I returned, I would find a world completely different from the one I left behind. Fate had a plan, and what was in store for her would be a blow far stronger than anything I could plan. What happens when someone who believes they have control loses everything at once? When betrayal not only destroys a marriage, but also dismantles an entire life. I didn't need to take revenge. Destiny itself would take care of that. And when she finally realized what she had lost, it would be too late. Welcome to the channel where the truth about cheating is exposed bluntly. Here, we do not support and never romanticize infidelity. All the stories are fictional, but they carry a real lesson. Betrayal destroys lives, corrodes bonds and has irreversible consequences. Get ready for an intense narrative, full of twists and emotions. Now, sit back, take a deep breath and prepare to hear a shocking story. Alex has always been a man of principle, someone who believed in the strength of commitment and the value of a promise made before an altar. From the moment he met Olivia, he knew she would be the woman he would share his life with. There was something about her that fascinated him, a perfect mix between sweetness and determination, a deep look that seemed to carry secrets and promises. At first, the connection between the two was intense, almost addictive. They spent hours talking, laughing, making plans for the future. He remembered the day he asked her to marry him, the sparkle in her eyes when she accepted, the tears that ran down her face when he slipped the ring on her finger. At that moment, he felt that nothing could shake what they were building together. But time, as always, tested this certainty. Their marriage was solid for many years. Of course, like any couple, they had challenges, moments of disagreement, phases in which the tiredness of routine weighed on their shoulders. But Alex always believed that love was a daily choice. He chose Olivia every morning when he woke up next to her, in every small gesture, in the care and attention he gave her. And for a long time, he was sure it was reciprocal. The years passed, and life followed its predictable course. Alex worked as a civil engineer, a job that required dedication, occasional travel and sleepless nights dealing with tight deadlines. Olivia, in turn, has always had an expansive personality. Communicative, full of life, she loved being surrounded by friends, planning meetings, staying socially active. I worked in marketing and seemed to thrive amid meetings, events, and new connections. The balance between the two has always been admirable. He was more reserved, while she brought the lightness and energy that he often needed. The marriage worked because, in some way, their differences complemented each other. But time began to introduce small cracks in this structure. Nothing drastic, nothing that sounded like an immediate warning, just small changes, small signs that, in isolation, didn't seem to matter much. Olivia started going out more often, justifying that she needed to unwind and relieve stress. She talked about girls' nights out, casual encounters with coworkers, moments of relaxation that, according to her, helped her maintain balance. Alex initially didn't see a problem. He trusted her. Always trusted. He was never a possessive or controlling man. But something started to bother him in a subtle way. It was the way she got ready before going out, the excessive time she spent on her cell phone, the way she seemed distant, even when they were together. Little by little, he realized that the conversations between the two were becoming more superficial. Before, they discussed everything, dreams, ambitions, deep thoughts about life. Now, their interactions were limited to practical matters, bills to pay, commitments for the week, what they needed to buy for the house. There were nights when he caught himself looking at her, trying to decipher what was different. Olivia was still beautiful, but there was something in her eyes that he couldn't understand. As if it were there, but at the same time far away. He wondered if this was just a natural effect of time, if they were simply going through a phase in which passion settled down and gave way to routine. But, deep down, an uneasiness was growing inside him, silent, almost imperceptible, but present. He tried hard to keep things right. He proposed trips, tried to rekindle the flame, prepared surprises. But it felt like something was slipping through his fingers. Olivia smiled, thanked her, but something in her didn't give in completely. He also began to notice that she changed the subject whenever he asked about going out with her friends. Before, she told details, spoke with enthusiasm. Now, he responded with short sentences, looked away, used his cell phone. He didn't want to become paranoid, didn't want to question his trust in her, but something inside him was warning him that something was happening, even if he didn't know what. Things started to become even more evident when he noticed that Olivia avoided moments alone. He didn't reject it directly, but he always had an excuse. I was tired, I had an early appointment the next day, I needed to resolve something at work. Alex felt the weight of these small refusals. It was as if, little by little, he was being pushed out of her life. And what distressed him most was that there were no discussions, there were no fights, there was no concrete thing to point to and say, this is wrong. It was just a gradual separation, a subtle coldness that settled like an invisible fog between the two. One night, when he saw her getting ready for another outing, he watched her in silence. She looked beautiful, impeccable, with a dress that highlighted her curves, her hair loose in well-groomed waves. The perfume she wore was stronger than usual, a small detail, but one that didn't go unnoticed. He watched her as she finished putting on her earrings in front of the mirror. When he noticed his gaze, he smiled slightly and asked if something was wrong. He took a deep breath, trying to choose the right words. "You've been going out a lot lately, is everything okay?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but not hiding his concern. Olivia smiled, a smile that seemed rehearsed. "Yes, of course. I just need some time for myself, you know. Work is busy, and these outings help me relax." He nodded, without saying anything else. I didn't want to seem insecure. He didn't want to be that husband who suffocates his wife. But something inside him was twisting, as if he were on the verge of a truth he didn't want to see. And that night, after Olivia left, Alex was left alone in the room, staring into space. He tried to distract himself with a movie, he tried to read, but the restlessness was there, relentless. Without meaning to, he ran his fingers over the ring, feeling the cold of the metal against his skin. Years of marriage, of history, of shared moments. He wanted to believe that everything was fine, that it was just in his head, that his wife was still the same woman who once promised him fidelity. But something told him that this was just the calm before the storm. In the days that followed, Alex tried to quell that suffocating feeling that was growing inside him, the silent suspicion that whispered in his mind whenever Olivia left. He repeated to himself that he was exaggerating, that there was nothing wrong, that it was just the natural wear and tear of time. But human instincts are rarely wrong, and something in him knew that this restlessness wasn't paranoia. I watched the patterns repeat themselves like a precise clock. Always the same excuses, the same schedules, the same way of leaving in a hurry while he stayed behind, trying to ignore that shadow of doubt that was creeping in. He began to notice details that had previously gone unnoticed. The cell phone that was never unlocked on the table, the messages that she responded to quickly and then deleted, the long showers before leaving, the strong perfumes that he didn't recognize. Everything was pieces of a puzzle that he still couldn't put together, but whose image was already creeping into his mind in a disturbing way. One night, sitting on the couch with a glass of whiskey between his fingers, Alex noticed that Olivia was getting ready to go out again. It was Thursday. He already knew the script. Impeccable dress, straight hair, careful makeup. Something inside him wanted to stop her, wanted to question her, but what difference would it make? He knew that any word from him would be met with a sweet smile and a rehearsed response. He watched her put on her shoes, pick up her bag and say goodbye with a quick kiss on the cheek. The door closed behind her and the silence that followed was deafening. This time, something inside him screamed louder. He could no longer ignore it. He took the car keys and, without thinking twice, left. Adrenaline coursed through his veins as he drove without a fixed destination, just following an instinct that led him blindly. I didn't know if I wanted to discover something, if I had the strength to face what I feared. But there was no going back. When he saw Olivia's car parked in front of a fancy restaurant, his chest tightened. He got out of the vehicle and stood there for a moment, watching. His heart was beating hard, his mouth was dry. He took a deep breath before approaching. Through the glass, he saw. There she was, sitting at a table for two, smiling in a way he hadn't seen in a while. But that smile wasn't for him. The man in front of her touched her hand on the table, leaned closer, and Olivia didn't flinch. On the contrary. His eyes sparkled in a way they hadn't sparkled for Alex in a long time. The betrayal was staring him in the face, naked and raw. His breathing became heavy, his stomach turned. He could have walked in there, he could have caused a scene, he could have confronted them both. But he remained still, watching, feeling the pain gnaw at every part of his body. He didn't know how long he stood there, watching his wife laugh, touch her hair, lean in seductively, openly flirt with another man. Every gesture was like a blade cutting into his skin. I felt the bitter taste of disappointment, the feeling of having been made a fool of all this time. Anger rose in his throat, but now was not the time to act. Not yet. He needed to see more. I needed to understand where this was going. He followed them as they left the restaurant. The man opened the car door for Olivia, like a charming gentleman. Alex clenched his fists when he saw her smile at him in a way she didn't smile at her own husband. The car drove off, and he didn't hesitate to follow them. Every kilometer covered was a blow to the chest, a confirmation of what he already knew, but which until that moment he hadn't had the courage to admit to himself. They didn't come home. The path led to a discreet hotel, far from the center, the kind of place where couples hide to avoid prying eyes. When he saw Olivia get out of the car and walk alongside her lover to the reception, something inside him broke once and for all. The anger, the pain, the humiliation, everything was mixed together in a storm of feelings that threatened to consume him completely. But he held back. I couldn't lose control now. There was something more he needed to understand, something that went beyond betrayal. Something that still didn't make sense. He watched as the two disappeared into the hotel. His chest rose and fell rapidly, as if trying to absorb the impact of what he had just witnessed. That night, Alex knew his life would never be the same. But there was still one detail he didn't know. Something that would change everything in ways he could never imagine. And he was about to find out. The hotel door closed behind her and Alex stood there in the car, his fingers gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. His chest rose and fell uncontrollably, and he felt the bitter taste of anger mixed with pain. It was real. It was no longer an assumption or a hunch. His wife, the woman who had once promised to love and respect him, was now on the other side of those walls, giving herself to another man. The initial shock began to dissipate, giving way to something darker, an uncontrollable need to know where this was all going. He needed answers. He needed to understand how it started, who the man was, how long everything had been happening and, above all, he needed to know who that woman was next to him. Because Olivia wasn't the same anymore. Time seemed to drag by as he waited. The night turned into dawn, and the weight of the truth began to crush him inside. He could just walk away, never look back, disappear once and for all, but that wasn't enough. He wanted her to know that he knew. I wanted to see her reaction when she saw him there, standing there, waiting for her, without needing to say anything. So he waited. And when, finally, the hotel door opened and she came out, laughing and arranging her hair beside her lover, something inside him exploded. He got out of the car and crossed the street with firm steps, determined, without hesitation. Olivia looked up and, for a moment, the world seemed to freeze. The smile died on his lips, his eyes widened, panic taking over his face. It took the man next to her a few seconds to notice the tension in the air, but when he finally realized something was wrong, he turned to face Alex. Olivia's breath caught in her throat, words ran through her mind, but nothing came out. The silence was deafening. Alex took another step forward, and the coldness in his gaze made her shiver. Her lover didn't seem to know how to react. There was nowhere to run, there were no excuses that could erase what had already been done. The seconds dragged on, heavy, until finally Alex broke the silence, his voice low, carrying something that made his wife shudder. He didn't ask anything. He just looked at Olivia with a look that spoke for itself, and that was enough for her to start babbling apologies, disjointed sentences, a pathetic attempt to remedy what was no longer fixable. But he didn't want an apology. I didn't want justifications. And then, before she could continue with her pathetic attempt to downplay the situation, Alex turned her gaze to the man beside her. And in that instant, something changed. He narrowed his eyes, as if trying to fit the pieces of a puzzle that, until that moment, didn't make sense. There was something familiar about that face. Something he couldn't immediately understand, but which brought a feeling of deep discomfort. His heart raced even more, but not from anger. This time, it was something different. And then, as if the world was breaking in half, the truth hit him with full force. He knew that man. But he didn't just know. That was your boss. The man he had worked for the past 5 years, the one who always praised his dedication, who sat across from him in meetings, who shook his hand and told him she trusted him. The man who knew every detail about his life. Your boss. The shock was so great that Alex felt his legs wobble. The betrayal was already a devastating blow, but this? His wife didn't just cheat on him. She cheated on him with someone who was part of his everyday life, someone who was present at his work, who had power over his career, who shared dinners and corporate events with him. It was more than a betrayal. It was a calculated humiliation, a stab that went beyond marriage. Olivia noticed the exact moment he understood everything. She saw when shock washed over his face, saw when his eyes lost any trace of humanity. She tried to speak, but this time he wouldn't let her. The silence that came from Alex was much worse than any scream, any outburst of anger. He simply looked at her as if she were a stranger. As if, suddenly, it was someone he had never met. The boss tried to intervene, to say something, but Alex didn't give him a chance. He took a step forward and faced him directly, his voice coming out firm, cutting. He wanted to understand. How long has it been? The question hung in the air, and the man hesitated for a second, before looking away, as if that were an answer. But Alex didn't need to hear anything more. He already knew. Olivia tried to grab his arm, tried to explain, but he backed away, as if her simple touch was something repulsive. His eyes were empty now. The man who, until that night, tried to save a marriage, tried to believe that everything was just a phase, now no longer existed. He was faced with raw reality. Their marriage was a sham. His wife was a lie. His entire life was an illusion. And then, without another word, he turned and walked away. He didn't run, he didn't scream, he didn't look back. He just walked, feeling the weight of the truth crushing every part of his being. The cold early morning wind cut into his skin, but he felt nothing. The betrayal was already a difficult blow to bear, but knowing that he was deceived by someone so close, by someone who had power over his professional life, was an even deeper wound. He got into the car and drove aimlessly, his hands shaking on the steering wheel, his heart in pieces. The bitter taste of humiliation was mixed with hatred and despair. He had lost everything. But deep down, a single certainty grew within him. It wasn't going to end like this. The car's engine roared as Alex sped through the deserted streets, with no destination, just his mind buzzing in a whirlwind of chaotic thoughts. Everything inside him was in shambles, but there was something growing, something new, something that wasn't just anger or pain. It was determination. He wouldn't allow it to end like this. The betrayal was devastating in itself, but the fact that it was with someone he saw almost every day, someone who posed as a leader, a friend, a mentor, made it so much worse. It wasn't just about losing his wife. It was about being ridiculed, manipulated, deceived in your own life. And this would not go unpunished. He parked in front of his house, but stayed in the car for a moment, observing the facade of the place that, until a few hours ago, he called home. Everything seemed normal, still, as if the world hadn't crumbled beneath her feet. But for him, that place no longer meant anything. He entered without making a sound, turned on a dim light in the room and threw the keys on the table. He walked to the bar, poured himself a generous glass of whiskey and sat on the sofa, staring into space. Olivia hadn't arrived yet. Of course. She was too busy saying goodbye to the man who destroyed her marriage. But then, as if the universe wanted to present him with yet another dose of irony, he heard the sound of the doorknob turning. The door opened, and she entered, cautiously, not knowing what she expected to find. She wore the same impeccable dress from the evening, but now it felt like a heavy burden on her shoulders. Her gaze swept around the room until she found him sitting there, in the dim light, a glass in his hand, his eyes fixed on her. And in that moment, Alex saw something he had never seen before: guilt. Not that rehearsed guilt, the one that manifests itself when someone is caught in the act and needs to improvise an excuse. No. It was something deeper. As if, for the first time, Olivia was seeing the destruction she had caused. She closed the door behind her and hesitated before speaking. The voice was hesitant, low, almost pleading. He just watched her, waiting for her to say something that would make a difference, something that would justify what she did. But there was no justification. She knew this as much as he did. I can explain. The words came out almost as a whisper, but he laughed, a short, dry laugh, without any humor. He slowly stood up and walked towards her, each step echoing in the suffocating silence of the room. Explain. His voice was firm but controlled. He didn't want angry outbursts, he wanted the truth. Explain what? That you lied to me? That made me look like an idiot for months. Who chose my boss to be his lover? She swallowed hard, tears began to form, but he was unmoved. There was no longer room for pity there. It wasn't like that, Alex, I swear, he tilted his head, eyes boring into hers. Wasn't it like that? So tell me, Olivia, how was it? How did it start? When did you look at it and decide I was no longer enough? She looked away, crossing her arms as if trying to protect herself. I didn't plan it, it happened. He snorted in disbelief. It happened. Of course. It was an accident, right? Did you fall into his arms and, without realizing it, start seeing each other in hotels? Don't talk like that, how do you want me to say it, Olivia? His voice rose a little now, not from the tone of anger, but from the desperation of trying to understand something that didn't make sense. I trusted you. I believed in us. I did everything for this marriage. And you repaid me like this. She ran her hands over her face, tears now streaming down, but he continued, merciless. And the worst, Olivia. The worst of all. You didn't choose just anyone. You chose someone who lived with me. Someone who looked into my eyes every day. This isn't just cheating. This is humiliation. That spitting in my face and laughing while I wiped it away. She sobbed, trying to hold back the tears. I never wanted to hurt you, he laughed again, sarcastic. Of course. But tell me, at what moment, between one dinner and another, between smiles and touches, between one hotel room and another, did you think of me? How would I feel if I found out? In everything we build? Or has that never crossed your mind? She was silent, and in that instant he knew the answer. It never passed. The silence was heavy. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his head straight. The anger was there, yes, burning inside him like an out-of-control fire. But above that, there was the certainty that it was already over. And the only thing left now was the exit. He took the last sip of the whiskey, placed the glass on the table and picked up the keys again. I'm leaving. Her eyes widened, as if reality was finally hitting her. What? Alex, please. We can work this out. He shook his head. No, Olivia. There is nothing left to resolve. You made your choice. Now I do mine. She tried to get closer, but he took a step back. Don't touch me. Her heart raced, her breathing hitched. I don't want it to end like this. He looked at her one last time, and in that look there was no longer love, only infinite sadness. But it's over. And then he left. The cold early morning air hit his face as he walked to his car. He started the engine and drove aimlessly, without looking back, without thinking about what he was leaving behind. At that moment, he knew that nothing would be the same as before. But for the first time in a long time, there was a certainty within him. He would start again. Away from her. Away from the pain. And this time, I would do everything differently. The road stretched ahead, streetlights flashing past the glass as Alex drove aimlessly, without thinking, just moving away. The silence inside the car was oppressive, and every thought in his mind seemed to scream at the same time. The engine rumbled low, a constant noise that filled the void but didn't drown out the feeling of falling apart inside him. He didn't know where he was going, just that he couldn't be there anymore, that that house was no longer his, that that woman was no longer part of his life. The past and present collided violently within him, blending into overlapping images: Olivia's smile on their wedding day, the soft touch of her hands in their first years together, the family dinners, the nighttime conversations before bed, all now corrupted by the relentless reality of betrayal. He parked at a random gas station, turned off the car and stood there, staring into space. His fingers drummed on the steering wheel as his mind wandered between anger and tiredness. He took his cell phone from the passenger seat, looked at the screen and saw dozens of missed calls. Olivia's name flashed repeatedly, accompanied by unread messages. He didn't need to open it to know the contents: excuses, empty justifications, attempts to fix something that was already completely destroyed. He felt a momentary urge to answer her, to say everything that was stuck in his throat, but for what? What could he say that wasn't already obvious? Silence was his best response. Betrayal was not just an isolated act. It was a succession of choices. Olivia hadn't just lost herself in a moment of weakness, it hadn't just been a slip. She chose to lie. She chose to deceive him every time she came home and pretended everything was fine. He chose to cross that line countless times, each encounter being a new stab that he only felt now, too late. And most of all, she chose to destroy not only his marriage, but also his respect for her. The sound of a horn brought him back to reality. A truck passed by, and Alex sighed deeply before picking up his cell phone again. This time, not to respond to Olivia, but to make the first concrete decision of that new phase of her life. He looked for a name in the contacts and pressed to call. The voice on the other end answered quickly, surprised by the time. "I need a place to stay." The answer came without hesitation. "Come here." That was it. A step away from that life. He arrived at his friend's house shortly after. The gate was open, and the porch light was on. He got out of the car and walked to the entrance, being greeted with a look of concern. They didn't need words to understand what had happened. His look spoke for itself, and the shared silence was more comforting than any phrase of consolation could be. He walked in, accepted the glass of water he was offered, and sat down on the couch. "Did she call you?" He let out a humorless laugh. "Several times." "And what are you going to do?" That was the question that haunted him. What would he do now? He ran his hand over his face, feeling the weight of recent events settling on his shoulders. I couldn't just go back to work as if nothing had happened. Her boss, the man who destroyed her marriage, would be there, as if nothing had changed. He knew it would be impossible to bear this. I felt disgusted at the idea of sharing any space with him. The only thing keeping him in that job was stability, but what did stability mean now that his life was in ruins? The decision came clearly. He couldn't stay there any longer. Not in that city, not in that job. I needed a fresh start. The following morning, he took the first step to cut once and for all the ties that linked him to that life. He sent a letter of resignation. Direct, without unnecessary explanations. A cold decision, with no room for regret. Olivia's messages kept coming. First the excuses, then the desperate attempts to find him. But when she realized he was completely ignoring her, her tone changed. The accusations came, the emotional threats, the attempt to reverse roles. But he didn't give in. I knew it was just her fear of facing the consequences, of facing what she herself destroyed. When he finally received a call from an unknown number and answered it, an arrogant voice sounded on the other end of the line. "Can we talk like two adults?" Alex's blood boiled. He recognized that voice from anywhere. "Your ex-boss." For a moment, he considered hanging up right away, but something inside him made him stay on the line. I wanted to hear. I wanted to understand what a man like that could have to say after destroying a family. "There's nothing to talk about." I know you're hurt, but it doesn't have to affect your career. You are a valuable professional. We can resolve this without things getting out of hand. Alex gripped the phone tighter. The cynicism in that man's voice was revolting. As if everything could be erased, as if everything was just an administrative problem. You destroyed my marriage and you still have the audacity to call me to offer me a corporate solution. I didn't destroy anything, Alex. Your wife made her choices. The words were calculated, meticulously planned to inflame his anger. But this time, it didn't explode. He just smiled bitterly. And now you have to deal with the consequences of yours. He hung up before hearing any response. That was it. He was out of that world. Out of that emotional prison. The next step was more difficult, but essential. He needed to face Olivia one last time. He returned home a few days later, already knowing exactly what he would do. I didn't want a confrontation full of tears and fake regrets. I just wanted to end it. He found her sitting on the couch, waiting. When he entered, she stood up, her eyes red, her expression filled with despair. Please Alex, can we talk? He stared at her for a long moment before responding. No more talking, Olivia. I came to get my things. She started crying, begging, saying that things could be different, that they could try, that he couldn't just throw away years of marriage. But the truth was, she had already done it. She had already made that decision when she chose to betray him, when she chose to continue, when she chose to get involved with someone so close, without caring about the consequences. He picked up his bags, walked to the door and stopped for a moment. I really loved you, Olivia. But you destroyed everything. And then he left. With every step I took away from that house, I felt the weight lessen. It still hurt, it still burned, but for the first time since that fateful night, he felt something new growing inside him. Freedom. And that was just the beginning. The weight of goodbye still hung in the air when Alex walked through the door of that house for the last time. The familiar smell, the furniture he had chosen alongside Olivia, every detail of that space that had been his home for so long was now nothing more than an empty setting, a place where his memories had been stained by lies and betrayal. He closed the door behind him and didn't look back. There was nothing left there for him. The past belonged to Olivia now, and he didn't intend to carry any fragment of that history with him. The night air was cold, but not cold enough to calm the storm still raging inside him. He put his bags in the car, got in and started the engine, letting the sound drown out the uncomfortable silence that was settling in. His chest was still heavy, but with every kilometer he walked away from that house, he felt like he was slowly breathing again. It was a forced fresh start, one he hadn't asked for, but now needed to embrace. He couldn't allow himself to be consumed by what happened. Life went on, and he had to find a new path. He drove slowly, without a fixed destination, just letting his thoughts organize themselves. Eventually, he stopped at a roadside motel. I didn't have the energy to look for a better place. I just wanted a bed where I could rest, even if sleep seemed like a distant illusion. As soon as he entered the small, characterless room, he threw his bags in a corner and sat on the edge of the bed, facing the floor. His cell phone vibrated in his pocket, but he didn't even need to look to know who it belonged to. Olivia. Another message, another attempt to patch up what was already irreparably broken. But this time, something inside him changed. He picked up the phone and, without hesitation, blocked her number. He finished. No more calls, no more messages, no more empty explanations. He needed to move on, and to do that, Olivia needed to be completely erased from his life. The next morning, he woke up feeling strangely empty. The sun came through the barely closed curtains, and for a moment he lay there, absorbing the new reality. I no longer had a home. He no longer had a wife. I no longer had a job. Everything he had built in recent years had collapsed in a matter of days. But at the same time, a small spark of relief began to grow inside him. I was no longer trapped in a lie. He no longer needed to deceive himself, to try to save something that had never been saved. He was a free man, even if he didn't know exactly what to do with that freedom. He spent the morning looking for a new place to live, something small, temporary, just enough to start over. He found a simple apartment, far from the house he shared with Olivia, far from the office where he spent his days, far from everything that reminded him of the life he had lost. He closed the contract quickly, and when he placed the few suitcases inside the new apartment, he felt like he was stepping into unknown territory. The house was silent, with no photos, no furniture that carried stories, just empty walls waiting for new chapters. He sat on the living room floor, looking around. It was strange. After years of living with someone, sharing every space, every moment, now he was there, alone. But for the first time in a long time, this loneliness didn't feel like a sentence. It looked like a blank page. The following days were of reconstruction. Alex threw himself into job interviews. He wanted to keep busy, keep moving, avoid the moments of reflection that insisted on pulling him back into the pain. He knew that, sooner or later, he would have to face the ghosts of what happened, but for now, staying distracted was what kept him standing. But fate seemed to have other plans. One night, as he was walking through a park near his new apartment, taking in the tranquility of the place, he heard a familiar voice calling his name. He turned around, and his chest tightened when he saw who was there. Molly. His ex-boss's ex-wife. For a moment, the two just stared at each other, surprised by the coincidence. He hadn't seen her since that night he found out everything, and from her expression, it was clear that things weren't easy on the other side either. She approached, a hesitant smile on her lips. I didn't expect to find you here. He let out a sigh and gestured around. I didn't expect to be here either. She nodded, as if she understood exactly what he meant. And, in a way, I understood. She was also betrayed. His life was also destroyed by a choice that was not his. He also had to start over from scratch. For some reason, her presence didn't bring discomfort. On the contrary, there was something almost comforting about finding someone who understood his pain without him having to explain it. Want some coffee? She asked, and he hesitated for a second before nodding. They went to a nearby coffee shop, and for the first time in a long time, Alex felt like he could breathe without the suffocating weight of betrayal on his shoulders. Molly told how she dealt with the divorce, how she faced the shame, the shock, the anger. He listened, and realized that his pain was not unique. Do you still think about her? She asked, after a moment of silence. He thought for a moment before responding. Less than yesterday. More than tomorrow. She smiled slightly. This is how healing begins. And in that moment, for the first time since everything happened, Alex felt that the pain wouldn't last forever. That maybe, just maybe, there was something new waiting for him at the end of that road. And that, despite everything, he could still find a new beginning. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Alex adapted to the new rhythm of life without looking back. The small apartment became a temporary home, a refuge where he could rebuild himself without the shadows of the past haunting him at every corner. The new job came up quickly, an unexpected invitation from a competing company, and he accepted without hesitation. Away from the old boss, away from the suffocating environment that used to be called a career. There was nothing holding him back to that story anymore. He was ready to move on. But fate, as always, likes to test those who try to escape its scars. One afternoon, as he walked down the street, he felt a strange cold run down his spine. Something familiar, something unwanted. When he looked up, his chest tightened. On the other side of the sidewalk, standing in front of a store window, was Olivia. His heart didn't race like it used to. There was no suffocating lump in the throat. Just a silent discomfort, a living reminder of everything that happened. She saw him too. Her look was different. There was no arrogance, there was no superiority. There was tiredness. There was regret. For a moment, time seemed to slow down. She hesitated, then took a step toward him. Alex could have turned and walked away. He could have ignored her presence as if she were no longer part of his story. But something inside him wanted to hear. Not because he still cared, but because he wanted to understand if she, on some level, understood the destruction she caused. They stared at each other for a few seconds before she spoke. "Are you well?" He raised an eyebrow, almost surprised by the simplicity of the question. But he realized that, for the first time, the answer wasn't complicated. "Yes." She let out a sigh, looking away for a moment. "I didn't know if I would ever get the chance to talk to you again." He crossed his arms, waiting. "And now that you have it, what does it mean?" She licked her lips, seeming to weigh each word before releasing them. "I'm very sorry." He didn't laugh. He didn't mock. He just watched her. It wasn't the first time I'd heard that from her. But this time, it sounded different. There was something in her gaze that indicated the regret was real. But regret does not erase choices. Don't undo the past. "And now?" he asked, more out of curiosity than any other reason. She shrugged. "Now I try to move on. Any way I can. But, nothing is the same anymore." He nodded slowly. "The choices we make have a price." She nodded back, her eyes filling with tears. "I just wish things had been different." He let out a light sigh and looked at her one last time. But they weren't. And then he turned and went his way. Olivia stood there, watching as he walked away, knowing this was the last time she would see him. There were no dramatic goodbyes, there were no pleas. Just the bare and raw reality. They were strangers now. She had to live with it. On the other side of the city, someone was also reaping the consequences of their actions. The man who once held a prestigious position, who played with lives as if they were pieces on a board, now faced his own decline. The betrayal that destroyed a marriage was just the tip of the iceberg. Scandals came to light, his credibility was tarnished, and before long, he was no longer anyone's boss. The company discreetly cut ties, a voluntary departure to avoid public repercussions. The career he built for years crumbled before his eyes. He discovered, the hard way, that some mistakes cannot be erased. Meanwhile, Alex continued his life. Night after night, he felt the weight of betrayal lifting. Not disappearing, but becoming a distant past, a scar that no longer defined him. Pain gave way to acceptance. And acceptance brought something unexpected. Molly. Conversations became frequent, casual meetings became more natural. There was no rush. There was no need to fill a void. It was just easy. Light. And that, for someone who spent so long suffocated by the weight of a destroyed love, was a fresh start that he never imagined he would have. And one night, as they walked side by side, she looked at him and smiled. "Have you ever thought that maybe all of this has led us exactly where we're supposed to be?" He looked at her, and for the first time since everything happened, he truly smiled. Perhaps. Because, at the end of the day, betrayal destroyed a marriage. But it didn't destroy the chance for a new beginning. And that was an ending he never expected, but that, somehow, he always deserved. Now, I want to know, what did you think of this story? Leave your comment and share your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories like this. And remember, betrayal never leads to a happy ending.